Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. On behalf of everyone at Rev.io, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'm Delaney Dabkowski, Rev.io Senior Marketing Manager. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, audio will automatically come in through your computer speakers. Second, a recorded version of this webinar will be emailed to you within 2 days. Third, we'll be having a Q&A session at the end of the event, so please submit your questions via the Zoom control panel at any point during the live presentation. For those of you just joining us, welcome. Today, Toby Barger, Senior Tax Strategist from Avalara, will be discussing how to manage communications tax in an increasingly connected world. Toby is a Senior Tax Strategist at Avalara. As part of Avalara's communications business unit, he has spent the last 18 years assisting clients with their complex transaction tax issues, particularly in the field of communications tax and regulatory cost surcharges. In addition to consulting on challenging client-specific tax questions, Mr. Barger assists in the training and setup of tax departments, the implementation and management of tax systems, and is a frequent speaker on transaction tax and regulatory issues. Mr. Barger holds a Bachelor of Science degree from William Jewell College and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Kansas School of Law. Mr. Barger is admitted to the practice of law before the Supreme Court of Kansas. Mr. Barger is a member of tax organizations such as the Institute of Professionals in Tax and the Broadband Tax Institute. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Toby.
Thank you, Delaney. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you, audience, for coming today. And hopefully this will be useful for everybody's time, that we can get you some information about some tax considerations that may be significant for you. So kind of just a quick word about what we want to talk today. A little bit about some of the taxes that are starting to expand and impact the technology industry beyond the normal sales and use tax and other transaction taxes that you may be familiar with, and a little bit into some of these specialized items with communication services taxes. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like and where that's coming from, and some of the cause and effect of what's leading to that from a public policy perspective, and then some considerations as to whether or not this may have an impact on you, whether any of these things are items that you need to worry about and need to have consideration for, and also things that could come about in your business that would potentially bring some of this stuff into your world. And then I want to spend a little bit of time about some of the things that are kind of out there as current events with tax. So for those of you who are already familiar with this, there'll hopefully be some value there as well. Some things that are kind of pertinent and ongoing controversies today. And then we'll kind of sum up with some kind of best practice tips around making sure that you are set up and equipped to deal with this stuff moving forward, wherever your tax needs take you. By way of introduction, for those who aren't familiar, Avalara is a tax automation business. We have a partnership with Rev.io, and our core function is around making life easy around calculating indirect tax obligations. So making sure that you have the right tax rates and that sort of thing winding up on your customer invoices. And Avalara's got a lot of specialized business units. People may not realize that are focused on certain particular market segments or certain parts of industry that have unique or different tax obligations. And I come from the communication tax business, and communications taxes, you can arguably make a case that they're potentially the most complicated transaction tax world that there is. There's debates about different industries and different verticals, have different levels of obligation and different tax burdens, and there are segments of industry that have probably more tax than the communications industry. But I would posit that what we have that goes on with taxation in the communications world is more complicated than what has to be dealt with anywhere else, particularly here in North America. And some aspects of that, the part of the complexity there is that communications is an enormously diverse industry, and I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and it started in the world, of course, of wireline communications, your old copper line phones that attach to your house and business and that sort of thing, and evolved with cell phone services and eventually voice over IP and cable television, satellite television, now streaming and IPTV type of products. And so there's a huge swath of different items there that all potentially have sometimes overlapping, sometimes not overlapping tax treatments, right? So there's a kind of a spectrum of taxes that potentially apply in those areas. And there's a lot of moving pieces there, because with the invoicing for all of these types of services, it's not uncommon that you're going to kind of have a combination of various items together, and some of them will be subject to some assortment of taxes and regulatory fees, and others will not. And there's relationships that you can have, obviously several taxes potentially applied to the same service, and sometimes those taxes need to tax each other. And long story short, it's a really complicated kind of a situation to wade through. So that's what we have worked to try and solve and make easy for you. My slide's a little garbled here, apologies for that, but one important thing to be aware of is that communications tax, no longer applies necessarily just to that core function of things that we would historically have thought of in regards to communication services. And illustrations of that, we would have thought of cell phone and wireline phone and obvious cable television, that sort of thing, that were clear-cut cases for communications tax. But we're seeing an evolution of the application of some of these taxes to other market areas or things that are more on the periphery, other technologies, and some of you guys may wind up being in some of these places where some of these additional tax treatments lie. The thing to be aware of with that is that it's an obligation that there's at least a solution for. These are things that the phone companies paved the path for, and it may be a little daunting to get into, but if you are finding yourself subject to these taxes for the first time, that's the challenge that we can help you out with. And so some examples of that, of places where there's an evolution and a migration of tax treatments, communications taxes finding their way into other types of products and services. Some examples of places we wouldn't necessarily have thought of, but if you think about the example of, for example, a Peloton or some of these other, high-tech, exercise products that are out there on the market, it's not uncommon that you can now find that there's a monthly recurring subscription charge with these services. And, with these monthly recurring, subscriptions, the customer is usually getting some sort of a video component, whether it's, live, exercise and fitness training, or, whether it might be pre-recorded material that they can, work out with. The challenge there is that by having a subscription that includes this sort of streamed video aspect, you've taken an industry that maybe is not at all intuitively a communication services, but you've imposed a potential component of the communications industry into that business. It's been injected into the business model. And so the tax treatments that potentially come out of that start to maybe look a lot like cable television, so there's definitions in some of the cable tax statutes, and things that they targeted at satellite and other forms of cable TV years ago that make references to pay TV and subscription video and things like that are very broad in some states. And so what we have seen is that at least in some of the more aggressive states that have communications taxes applied to cable and satellite TV, that they have taken stances that the definitions of these are, kind of, their tax treatment is all encompassing and potentially covers, these use cases that we wouldn't necessarily, intuitively think of as, subject to a communications tax. In similar, vein, it's, relation is some of the consumer devices that are now out there in the market. So, obviously a lot of the connected home devices get attention, so there's the picture of the Ring doorbell, but other examples, you have connectivity for, things outside of the home potentially. You now have drones you can purchase that require a data card. If you get an action camera that you're going to take on vacation with you, it may come with a monthly recurring charge for an additional feature set. And what oftentimes is coming as part of these additional feature sets with these devices is connectivity. They're connecting the device to the cloud, whether it's to transmit video or data or information. You name it, information coming off of your car. It's not uncommon now that most cars are being sold with an internet connection to the vehicle, and you probably pay a subscription for that. And sure, maybe part of that is for the passengers' use, that they might surf the net and that sort of thing. But another piece of it is that it's to feed information about the oil status and fuel and everything else with the vehicle, so that you can access it from an app, and maybe use it to find your vehicle in the parking lot and all that sort of thing. So there's a lot of different use cases here. But the long story short, what we've wound up with is that a lot of manufacturers and technology companies that maybe were nothing that anybody would have ever thought of before as being in the business of selling communication services are now having to sell cellular connections and data connections and other various cloud services that may have implications here as well. And that's created a significant change in the market. And kind of the third evolution here that has been significant in terms of opening up new avenues to tax jurisdictions to apply communications taxes is the implementation of communications features in other various cloud software applications. And some great illustrations of this. Salesforce now has modules available that you can directly call prospects or call team members and things like that, or message them. There's various Adobe Creative Suites and things like that. Microsoft Office Suite obviously has incorporated the Teams solution, but lots of productivity tools that now allow you to either call people internally on your team or your group, or even potentially call people out in the wider world, and potentially SMS or create text messages, various directional connections that can take place. That potentially opens up the realm that, once again, in addition to the hardware companies that were picking up communications tax, now there's a lot of software companies that nobody necessarily thought of before as being a communications company. We don't think of Salesforce, for example, as being a phone company, but if they build phone features into their software, that starts to potentially make them look like a phone company. And so all this said is that this is an evolution and a kind of a migratory path where you can see that aspects of the communications industry are kind of creeping in other places. So streaming has obviously been a really specific and explosive growth area over the last couple of years, particularly through the time of the pandemic. And as I mentioned, streaming services have had several jurisdictions kind of attack them from a tax perspective, and I'll talk some specifics of that here later on. But the long story short is that these are attractive revenue bases, right? The cable and satellite television subscription market has been on a steady decline, as has been well publicized, as people cut the cord and do away with those packages out of their cable bundle and that sort of thing, and remove the video piece. And you know, some of you may be in the streaming business, so I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. And so the tax jurisdictions obviously are very eager to, you know, find, you know, a replacement for that traditional cable and satellite television, you know, revenue stream. And, you know, some of these streaming products are, you know, obviously quite attractive. One thing that is kind of interesting, you know, when we talk about streaming, you know, immediately you think of, you know, the well-known entertainment platforms, you know, things like you know, Disney and ESPN and, you know, Netflix and Hulu, et cetera. And, you know, obviously that kind of is the front and center of a lot of this conversation, and a lot of the tax proceedings that have actually taken place in many of the jurisdictions have kind of featured those companies. But video has really kind of become a service that is a lot more than that, right? You know, it's not just necessarily, you know, the big top line, you know, entertainment. And within those entertainment platforms, there's obviously been a lot of diversification that's taken place, you know, over the last, you know, couple of years, and that's probably going to continue, right? You know, it's pretty predictable that, you know, all of the big sports leagues and, you know, all of the other, you know, every sort of entertainment franchise out there has got incentive to want to launch their own, you know, platform and deal directly with the consumer on this. So it's really proliferated a lot of parties that are operating in this space. But then there's obviously a lot of other use cases that are out there as well. You know, fitness that we already touched upon. You know, it's one other thing to not overlook the streaming audio piece of this. You know, obviously there's the big names, Spotify and, you know, Sirius XM and, you know, some of the other large companies that are out there. But one of the things that's kind of interesting with the music and the audio side of things is that it was a slower adoption for people to start talking about taxation on those services. And part of the reason there was that, you know, the music services, really the industry they were replacing was terrestrial radio, right? And terrestrial radio obviously did not historically have a price point for it, right? You know, it was something you got free over the air. And so there was not a very established, you know, paradigm of taxing, you know, audio services in the pre, you know, cloud age. And so it didn't give states a great roadmap of how they necessarily wanted to tackle this. And so there was kind of an initial, you know, response to in the tax world to a lot of these types of services to say, hey, maybe that isn't necessarily a taxable good, because there wasn't things you could turn to in the definitions and obviously find it. That has somewhat evaporated, right? And we have now seen not only a lot of jurisdictions applying sales tax to those subscriptions, but we've also seen some states like Florida go ahead and apply additional communications taxes to the streaming, you know, music and audio services as well. Virtual, you know, religious activities, public speaking, you know, webinars like what we're doing now. There's kind of an open question about what that's going to look like moving forward. You know, if this was a you know, obviously you guys aren't paying to listen to me, and I'm sure you're probably happy you didn't fork over good money for this today. But you know, in the instances where there are scenarios where people pay to listen to a speaker or you know, some sort of a you know, an educational opportunity and things like that, this is kind of an interesting crossroads from a tax and legal perspective, in that, you know, as these services migrate more and more to a you know, virtual and cloud, you know, based situation, you've got kind of a merger of two different worlds, right? You know, there's the traditional, you know, television and, you know, entertainment based streaming side of things, and then you've got, you know, providers, you know, event promoters and you know, religious, you know, speakers and, you know, professional development speakers and things like that, that had you know, a traditional, you know, usually low, if not no tax, you know, treatment when they were doing these sorts of services, you know, in person pre-pandemic. But now that this stuff has migrated online, there's a potential kind of a an interesting collision between these two industries of streaming entertainment and some of these other sort of niche or side cases of things that come to play. And frankly, I'll tell you, I don't think anybody's got a real great idea of where that's going to wind up from a tax perspective, but it's going to be fascinating to watch. For those of you who are in the streaming space, there's a lot to keep in mind, but some of the things to be aware of out there is that it's not all the same. There's not just a universal treatment that applies to all streamed media services, no matter what. You can't just treat it as one taxable bucket. There's actually a lot of variables that go into determining, what and where, taxes apply to these types of services. And, I've got up here kind of a decision tree that I think of as being potentially pretty useful in figuring out, the taxability of this. And, this is kind of illustrates that there's a lot of things that wind up going into this. But obviously, what type of media it is that's being streamed, makes a big difference, right? There's different states have different tax applying depending upon whether it's video that's being streamed, or music being streamed, or games being streamed, and maybe even some differentiation within that, for different types of video and that sort of thing. And then, how it's delivered can make a difference. And the two options that I've got up here on the screen, whether it's an on-net delivery or an over-the-top delivery. And, so some people may immediately recognize the meaning of those terms, but for those who are not immediately, catching the wind of that, an on-net stream service would be a scenario where, the network provider, the actual broadband internet provider itself, is the one who is selling the streaming service. And over-the-top services is when you do not sell any internet to the customer. They're bringing their own internet connection in order to access and stream it. And there are some instances of places where there are states that are more apt to tax the stream, in particular video, if it's being sold by the network provider. So for example, if it is a Comcast streaming package, for example, that is going to be delivered over a Comcast data network, then there are jurisdictions that are going to take the position that streaming content over that connection would be more taxable than it would be if it was purely an over-the-top connection. For example, a Netflix content delivered over the same Comcast network. And so that is a potential wrinkle to be in consideration. I don't know if anybody listening today is an on-net provider, but that does potentially put you at kind of a tax disadvantage in some places. Another distinction that is relevant in quite a few states is whether or not the content is live or on demand. Live content obviously being live broadcasts like we would think of with normal traditional TV services, live sports, live news, broadcast in real time, versus on demand like a traditional Netflix viewing scenario where you're going to go in and choose whatever that's already out there in the market. And there are jurisdictions where that is split in terms of the tax outcome. And I can't tell you that there's necessarily a clear-cut case that one's more taxable versus the other, beyond that, it does make some differences from state to state as to which tax comes into play. And then kind of the final item, which oftentimes gets overlooked in this consideration, is what does the monetization model look like for this? So is this a subscription-based service, or is it, like, for example, a Disney or a Netflix or something along those lines? Or is it transactional, where you either rent or purchase a particular show? And you can think, for example, of, if I pay to watch a movie and I'm given a 3-day span from Amazon Prime or something like that, or I can potentially pay Amazon to have the rights to stream that movie for life. And actually both of those sort of sub options of that transactional model can potentially drive you to different places for tax, right? So the limited rental time period versus the lifetime license model. Either one can potentially go to different places, but they're both distinct from, say, a subscription that you're just consuming as much as you care. And then finally, there's obviously the advertising-based monetization, and usually the advertising-based monetization, and once again, think non-premium YouTube, for example, does not typically result in tax for the consumer because of the fact that there isn't money changing hands at the consumer level there, right? And tax jurisdictions still haven't generally found out a great way to put indirect tax on transactions that don't have charges. But it's worth noting that there are quite a few jurisdictions that are starting to look more and more at taxing the receipts from that advertising. So it's kind of taking place at a different level, and it's not what we normally think of in a retail billing perspective, but it is not immune from potential tax treatment. So switching gears from the the streaming video and entertainment and audio and that sort of thing, talking a little bit about some of that IoT and device taxation that I mentioned at the outset. And IoT, for those who are not familiar, it stands for Internet of Things. And as I was kind of illustrating at the beginning, this is referring to any sort of these consumer devices, whether it be cars or drones or doorbells or garage doors or whatever else that would wind up being sold with a potential data connection in order to either deliver information off the device or video content or whatever the case may be. And obviously this is proliferating. If you read a lot of articles about what 5G networking is all about, it's not necessarily about making sure that you have really fast smartphones. It's about making sure that the network can support trillions and trillions of these connected devices. Everybody's car, everybody's sprinkler system, everybody's drone, you name it. Agricultural sensors, oil well monitors. There's lots of commercial and industrial and civil engineering applications and everything else. And this is obviously a pretty significant evolution of where everything's going from wireless communications. It does present some pretty interesting tax considerations. And the key detail there is that word internet, right? So for those who are kind of familiar with some communications tax law, you may be aware of a law called the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act, which was passed by Congress back in the 1990s and kind of reformed multiple times over the years to its current form. But the general idea of this law is it prevents state and local government from applying tax to internet connections, right? And they passed this with the idea that they wanted to promote everybody in America getting connected to the internet. And that's been a pretty big success. Obviously, we're all mostly getting onto the internet. So you would look at the word IoT, Internet of Things, and say, well, it says internet there. So does that mean that this is tax exempt, immune from state and local taxation? And the answer to that is maybe, and this is a tricky conversation because it's something that in the technology, versus tax law perspective, things have not really quite caught up, and we don't have a lot of great certainty around it. There's some reason for doubt around some of this, right? That if you have some of these devices that you're purchasing internet connections for, there's some question marks about whether or not those subscriptions for the data packages, attached to those devices really count as internet access, or whether they might potentially need a different tax treatment. And the question there is if you have a device that doesn't actually allow anybody to get to the World Wide Web, there's no browser, there's no human UI, there's no function for any of that, right? It's purely transmitting streams of information through IP. There's a real open question about whether or not that really satisfies some of the federal definitions of what constitutes internet access for the purpose of the federal moratorium. And so, if I do have, for example, an oil well sensor that, is reporting information back to the, central command center somewhere to tell how much, oil is in the tank and, what the pump flow is and, all that sort of information that, people monitoring oil wells might care about, that maybe using IP, the information that's getting sent back and forth is transmitting through the, internet pipe, so to speak. But that sensor doesn't really allow anybody to get to the World Wide Web. And, there's no browsing functionality. It's sort of some doubt there if you start to look at it and say, boy, I'm not so sure that really looks like what's being sold as ISP service. So if it isn't ISP service, where does it go? And more importantly, where does it go for tax? And so the potential landing spot, if it's not defined as internet, would be that it would wind up being taxed as WAN or LAN network data, right? And when you intuitively start to think about it, that's a lot what these devices start to look like. And so if it's WAN or LAN networking data, what is the tax treatment for that? And unfortunately, it's not nearly as good of a spot as internet, right? So internet, you've got that state and local moratorium that prevents most tax from applying. WAN and LAN networking, has, potentially federal universal service applied to it, and also various state communications taxes, and obviously a whole heck of a lot of sales tax, and there's considerations about whether the networking is interstate or intrastate, and it's a much bigger headache, not necessarily the place anybody wants to be. So that is a potential hiccup. Unfortunately, we're at an early enough stage in the evolution of the tax landscape that there's not great established precedent there, right? So there's not certainty that the tax jurisdictions are going to go that direction, but obviously we know the tax jurisdictions have all the incentive in the world to go there if they think they can, right? Because the difference to the tax jurisdiction is between getting no tax if it's internet versus getting some or even in some cases a lot of tax if it's categorized as WAN or LAN networking. The FCC is not a disinterested party in that, as I mentioned, because if it is interstate connectivity, then there's a federal universal service implication as well, which obviously they would love to bring more revenue into the federal universal service pool. So it's something to be aware of, something to keep an eye on, and a interesting technology evolution that will raise continuing tax considerations for a while. With that, it's a good note to talk about tax considerations. That kind of illustrates a common point. That you have a service that is a relatively emerging technology footprint. The tax law, the regulations, the pronouncements from the tax jurisdictions are not caught up with it, which is a pretty common situation in our field, unfortunately. As I said, I've been doing this for 20 plus years, and over the course of that time, there's never not been a point where it wasn't true to say that technology is ahead of the law. That's kind of an inherent truth. And so there's always some doubt about, especially if you're dealing with some sort of an emerging area, or new technology, there's oftentimes a question mark about, do I categorize this product in a conservative way and tax it like the, probably more legacy equivalent of what this, product or service looked like, or do I go more aggressive and take a less taxable position and say that whatever the new technology is, that it's maybe more of like a information service or something along those lines. And the real potential challenge there is that you wind up on the wrong side of that decision, obviously. And so this kind of is illustrated by this market survey that we conducted earlier this year with Aberdeen. If we ask some questions of companies who are in some of these spaces, IT, digital media, software, consumer electronics, and found out what were the leading causes of why they wound up failing audits, what were the chief issues there. And as you can see, it's kind of a tie for the leading causes, and all these numbers were fairly close, but they all point to kind of a similar issue, right? So 19% of the respondents didn't realize that what it was that they were selling was subject to communications tax. 18% of them, maybe realized but opted to file just sales and use tax instead, which obviously was, I guess maybe a calculated decision that they may have lost. And then, another 19% of them just didn't really know it was an issue in the first place, which is also, not where you necessarily want to be. So if you are operating in any of these spaces at the periphery of the communications, world in the technology area, I can't tell you that you can go out there and find black letter law answers to all of these questions, right? It's not always going to be possible, and that's just kind of the nature of the services. But it's not an ignorance is bliss type of a situation either, though, right? You want to kind of document where you do have some of those uncertainties, and what your thought process. You may wind up having to make that decision about, do we tax on the more conservative direction, or do we tax on the more aggressive position? But you'd like that decision to hopefully at least be documented, and in some cases it may be something that rises to the scenario where you need to reserve or book a liability related to some of those decisions if you do decide to opt in the more aggressive position. But it's always better to have that be fairly transparent within your organization. I don't know any tax managers or billing managers that want a responsibility for having to explain to the C-level at your enterprise that, hey, we're paying this big check because it was something we didn't think about, right? That's never a good answer. It's one thing to say we're writing a big check in response to this audit because we lost the calculated risk that we decided to take, but it's usually a less popular move if it's a scenario of we're writing this big check because we didn't know that this was a potential risk. And so some things that could be affecting your business, or maybe things that you have on the horizon that could affect your business that would, potentially trigger some of this stuff. That's one of the hardest things with this, especially if you are on the peripheries, is, knowing when you're going to potentially cross over that line and wind up in a world where you have to start worrying about some of this stuff, right? And some of the triggering events that would potentially be the sorts of things that should at least get you asking the question of, hey, do I need to look at this, or do I need to potentially consult with somebody, or bring in an advisor or something along those lines? Well, if you do any sort of scenario where you're starting to bundle any of these communications functions, whether it be data, internet, wireless SIM service, or maybe you're implementing a VoIP or a chat function into your productivity software, or maybe you're adding subscriptions to a device of some sort that are going to potentially bring in some value-added features. You make sure that you've paid attention to what that other stuff is. Oftentimes when you bring in these bundled functions and add them to existing products or to existing industries and businesses, it's not uncommon that you may partner with third parties for some of that stuff, and it's potentially easy to add some of these things, right? The companies have made it easy to incorporate into your business development. And the downside of that is that your product and business development people may be hatching these plans without even realizing that they're setting you up to become a phone company or a data networking company or something along those lines until after the fact, and that's never a good scenario. Another event to keep your eyes on that potentially impacts the breadth of these taxes is expanding geographic footprints, right? So this is a thing that's relevant in almost any industry, but particularly in the communications industry, that the fact that so many of these services now are available over the top, that you don't have to be a network provider, you don't have to build out your own infrastructure to sell a lot of these communication services. The upshot of that is it's the sort of thing where a lot of these product launches, if nobody's really thinking about it, potentially you wind up day one selling services in hundreds of countries, for better or worse, right? Or all of the states in the United States. And that's a blessing and a curse, right? It's great from a business growth perspective that we have all these services now that you can launch over a whole broad footprint all over the world and potentially generate revenue all over the world. But that does also potentially open up the possibility that you're going to be, targeting taxes all over the world as well. And so it is a scenario where if you are in one of those, startup, sort of areas where you are going to be launching a new service of some sort, to maybe take a step back there at the beginning and say, hey, wait a minute, do we, want to, have to potentially consider the, tax and business licensing requirements and that sort of thing of going into selling these services, globally right out the door. Maybe it does need to be sort of a considered and thoughtful approach. At the worst case scenario, I've seen scenarios where people have launched, streaming services and some other products and turned it on the whole breadth of the internet. And of course, the upshot being that out the door, you wind up selling into countries where maybe it's not necessarily even legal to sell into from the United States. So obviously there gets to be considerations that are beyond tax with that, but it's a thing to keep an eye on. And if you do wind up with these services, you can wind up with a lot of tax jurisdictions that you're obligated to register and file into really fast. So you do need to be careful with that. Mergers and acquisitions, obviously these, potentially bring in the possibility that you may, if you're acquiring somebody, you may wind up acquiring a business line or a communications product that you hadn't previously had to manage before. And so that obviously triggers things. The other thing to be aware of with M&A activity, especially if any of you are in the, sort of fast growth startup side of things, is to be cognizant of the fact that these transaction taxes, and particularly these communications taxes, have also long been known to disrupt many either public offering or acquisition deal. So if you are working towards hopefully launching your own public business, or maybe you want to sell your business down the line and cash out, that might ultimately be the goal of your corporate leadership. Be aware that if you haven't taken care of some of the communications tax obligations, maybe you were selling something and taking one of those more aggressive positions on the tax technology side of things and saying, hey, we think that this is something we can tax as an information service or something along those lines. There's an intense risk that during the due diligence of that, M&A, that potentially the tax position that you've carved out for yourself, especially if it wasn't well documented and you didn't reserve liabilities for it and that sort of thing, could potentially derail things. So that's a scenario to keep in mind and be aware of. Online, sales, obviously, probably most of you guys are selling this stuff online. One thing to be aware of in the context with a lot of these services is that you could potentially find yourself becoming a marketplace. So with a lot of these types of things that we're talking about, streaming video and audio and some of these other products, it's not uncommon now that a lot of people have come up with a business model that, hey, maybe I'm not going to actually create all of my own content. Maybe I'll create a platform for other people to bring and sell content, whether it's their events or their musical concerts or their educational content, whatever the case may be, and I'll just act as a marketplace. And yes, that sounds like a great business model, right? Have some other people do the work, and I'll just build the platform and host it all. But be aware that there are a lot of rules out there that have evolved for marketplace sellers, that originally were designed for going after, the eBays and Amazons and that sort of thing in the world, and making sure that they're, sales tax compliant on those transactions for third-party sales, that also potentially extend and cover things like a video marketplace or an audio marketplace where you're offering some of this content on behalf of other creators. And so that's another thing to keep an eye on. And obviously, if you're reselling other services, I talk to a lot of folks that, maybe they don't have their own streaming service nowadays, but they're going to incorporate, a Netflix or a Hulu or whatever into a bundle of some other service. That's obviously become a really popular, way of expanding the scope of your relationship with the customer. But that can create a scenario where you wind up by adding that resold item into your product offering, taxes that you weren't used to having to deal with in the past. And so some general kind of words about some things that are current events with tax out there on the horizon. And so one of the things that's always a big attention grabber in the communications tax world is federal USF. And so for those who maybe are newer to having to be concerned about some of these things, Federal Universal Service is a program run by the FCC that's designed to help support making sure that there's lots of internet connections in places where it's hard to get the internet, right? So rural areas and mountainous areas and areas where there's infrastructure challenges and that sort of thing. And so this program's been around for decades. It has grown to be an extremely kind of obnoxious rate of tax, right? So it isn't technically a tax, it's a surcharge because carriers are collecting their own obligations from the customers. But the factor this year, it's revised every quarter, and in the second quarter, it hit an all-time high of almost 34%, and it's been over 30% pretty consistently now for the last couple of years. The general trend is that it is continuously rising. Every couple of quarters, it'll maybe take a step back temporarily, but generally it's a march forward. And to illustrate that, when I first got into this business around the early 2000s, this was into the mid single digits, right? So it has grown at a relatively exponential pace. And a big part of what's driving that is kind of an imbalance of the revenue base, what the tax jurisdictions are collecting on versus the obligation of what they're trying to fund, right? So the Federal Universal Service Program now devotes most of its money towards trying to fund broadband deployment, right? Making sure everybody has a good internet connection, which makes sense. That's the likely direction most of us would say that the FCC is going to try and promote deployment, that making sure everybody has access to broadband would be the way to go. The challenge is that the revenue base that it applies to is the FCC defined basis of interstate and international communication services. And this is typically covering wireline and wireless voice services and some of that WAN networking types of services, but overall kind of a shrinking market, right? The market for voice, the prices continuously get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and the value of those services and bundles get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and people have less phones in their home and that sort of thing. International long distance even is now pretty cheap for the most part. And so this is a declining and shrinking tax base that has this growing burden of trying to fund broadband connectivity. And so it's kind of a rock and a hard place there that's created, and that's how we wind up with 33+% federal USF contribution basis. So it's not been unknown that for a lot of years, this is something that the FCC probably needs to address or Congress needs to address. And, it used to be that we saw a lot of efforts in Congress trying to, maybe reform the contribution factors and how that's collected and what the basis is. And Congress never really got around to it, and they don't even really, try in the current, congressional climate. And so it's probably back to the FCC. This will be an interesting thing to watch. The obvious direction that most of us who've been in the space for a long time would probably say as to where the FCC probably would like to go with this will be to apply federal universal service to internet, right? It kind of makes sense that if the internet industry is going to get all of the benefit that we're paying to deploy and expand broadband access everywhere, then the way to make that sustainable is to collect from broadband revenues, which currently are not subject. But obviously there's a lot of political, back and forth on that and hesitancy, and nobody wants to be the politician who's known for quote unquote taxing the internet. That's never going to be a popular thing. So it has been something that there's been a kind of a reluctance to do. It is probably back up onto the front burner of attention though. And, the current Federal Communications Commission, we're still looking to get it fully staffed with commissioners, but once that is the full complement, there's probably a likelihood that they're going to take up some of these issues. And in fact, related consideration is the classification of internet as the net neutrality conversation has had a lot of traction, which kind of feeds into some of the issues with the federal USF contribution function. But anyway, that's worth keeping an eye on. Definitely a current event, potentially one of the bigger changes that's out there that potentially comes up with things. The other kind of current events that we've been keeping a close eye on are some things around the tax collection implications around streaming services. This is another issue where you have a challenge that tax jurisdictions are facing, declining revenues in the form that cable and satellite television services are increasingly facing this cord cutting challenge as folks migrate to streaming services. And so there are a lot of taxes that are applied to cable television in addition to sales tax, franchise fees, communication service taxes, utility users taxes, things along those lines. And so the bases for all of those are in significant decline. And so there's no doubt the tax jurisdictions would like to continue to move on that. It's interesting, we have seen several states now that are collecting some of those cable taxes and communications taxes, Florida communication service tax, Kentucky utility tax, some California utility taxes. Chicago's got an amusement tax that gets a lot of attention. So there's some other things out there already besides sales tax. Most of what we've seen with the taxation of streaming services so far is relied upon jurisdictions that are reading the tax into existing definitions, right? So Florida's communication service tax had this really broad definition of pay TV that'd been around for a while, and so they were able to say, hey, look, if we squint, we can see streaming services there in that existing definition of pay TV, so we think the tax applies, right? We've been predicting for a while now that we expect that there will be jurisdictions that actually start to legislate changes in the definitions, so maybe their definition wasn't broad enough to cover it out of the door. And we've started to see some of that as well. Maryland, back in the spring, passed a revision of their sales tax statute to explicitly pull in some other digital goods as well. But then we've also seen here recently West Virginia, issued a regulatory interpretation that was reading, the existence of streaming into their existing definition for sales tax. So there's a give and a take there, that there's kind of two different approaches to it. But no doubt they're going to continue to receive attention from the tax jurisdictions. The other thing that's kind of been an interesting thing to follow is there's been a number of cities across the country that have sued, typically class action lawsuits, to try and force some streaming providers to contribute to their franchise tax regime. So franchise taxes were a set of taxes that a lot of cities implemented when they had cable services come to town that are essentially designed to regulate the use of the public rights of way, right? So the cable companies had to go dig in the streets and overhead lines and that sort of thing to get to the customer's premise. And in order to regulate all of that, the jurisdictions would pass these franchise requirements that you needed to get permission from the city first. And as part of that, you would typically pay a franchise fee to the city. And there was a federal cap that's 5% of receipts that you earn in the city, right? So these franchise fees are all over the country, and they've been getting revenue from cable and satellite, not satellite, the satellite's not in the public right away, which is an important detail, but cable companies have been paying into these for years. And so obviously as things migrate to streaming, the attraction for the tax jurisdictions is to say, hey, we'd like to apply that to streaming as well. And sure enough, Texas, Missouri, Indiana, all have had class action lawsuits trying to force that issue. The good news is that one of those decisions, at least this week, or a week or two, came out in Texas and essentially found in favor of the streamers on that they are not subject to franchise fees. They're not in the public. So be interesting to see what happens in the other circuits and whether it kind of goes with the same trend, but I'd kind of be surprised if it doesn't. But another thing to keep an eye on. So how do you future-proof your business? Always the fascinating question. There's no great magic to this other than doing your homework, right? Making sure that you are aware of what it is that you're selling and what your product offerings are likely to evolve into. If you are coming to us from, say, the tax department or the billing department of your business, accounting, make sure you have a seat at the table with your product team, right? One of the things that's a recurring challenge that I always hear about is, the tax, group or the billing group is kind of the last to know, right? A product has already been launched, or, some new feature set's been added, and you don't necessarily find out about it until you've already sold it, right? And obviously that's a bad place to be in for tax, because it doesn't mean that you had time to prepare or make sure you're registered for new taxes and that sort of thing. So make sure you have a seat at the table if possible. Make sure you're invited to some of those product roadmap meetings and that sort of thing, and have some information about what's going on. Make sure that you actually have a relationship with a tax expert, right? And the other kind of qualifier there, I would say, is that make sure that it's somebody who specializes in communications and technology issues, right? All of the big accounting firms and that sort of thing have practice groups that are specialized in these areas around technology and communications, because of the fact that there's a lot of specific things that go on with the tax. Make sure you're working with those folks, right? If you are operating in these spaces, because if you just work with Joe Schmo tax advisor, there's a decent chance they may leave out some of this information because they're just not clued into what's going on with it, and that can obviously be a potential problem. And obviously making sure that you have the systems in place to support automating and dealing with these tax requirements. And that's a great pivot to sum up a little bit of a word or two about Avalara for Communications. So Avalara for Communications offers a SaaS-based tax automation solution specific for the communications industry. Obviously, the broader Avalara organization can deal with general goods and services, taxes, and that sort of thing. But within our communications business, we have a SaaS solution that can handle the tax treatment for pretty much everything we've talked about today, whether it be traditional communication services, traditional cable, satellite television, but also streaming and IoT and various technology products on the periphery of communications. We've designed ourselves to be able to serve all of those markets. And obviously we have a great partnership with Rev.io, and have been able to implement a direct connection between the two systems to be able to seamlessly get all of that tax information back and forth and onto your invoices, so that you're collected and compliant with all of that. And so I am running out of time here fast. I hopefully can maybe a question or two before everybody has to jump off. So I don't know, Delaney, do we have any questions that have come in?
Yeah, that was great, Toby. Thanks again for your time. Before we begin the Q&A portion of the presentation, I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today and review a few housekeeping items. The first reminder is that we're always interested in topics that you'd like to learn more about, so please submit your topic ideas in the Q&A box. In addition, the full webinar recording will be emailed to you within 2 days. Lastly, if you've submitted any questions during the presentation that don't get addressed in the live Q&A, we'll be following up with you individually via email. And now I'd like to ask a few questions from our audience. I sell something in the IoT realm, but I am still unclear if we owe communications tax. What is the best way to find out?
Yeah, as I was mentioning, unfortunately, it's an area where there's still a degree of some uncertainty in the tax law, right? You're not going to actually find the word IoT in much of any existing regulation or tax statutes or anything along those lines. My best advice on that is to consult an expert, right? And so you may not get a black letter answer about whether or not your particular offering of the way that you've bundled those functions into your product, whether or not that is absolutely going to count as a communication service or not. But it's better to at least have that memo in the drawer outlining the rationale. If you decide to go with internet tax treatment versus whether you decide to go with data tax treatment. Make sure that that is documented, how you got there, what the risk evaluation was. And for the most part, unfortunately, it is kind of a risk evaluation position right now. What is the risk tolerance in your organization? What is the exposure on that? Some folks, have decided to go all in on taking the internet only tax treatment, and other folks have looked at it and said, hey, this is not how we're making for revenue stream, and so we don't really want to take a risk on it. We don't want the headache of the potential nightmare down the road. But as I said, better to have somebody's letterhead opinion in the drawer that's kind of documented why your organization is where they're at.
Awesome, thank you. And I'll ask one more question. I know we're short on time, but what is the taxability of streaming live events?
Live events is a really fascinating thing, right? So it's for illustration, what some of that might look at, like concerts and boxing and football games and that sort of thing. Maybe live conferences even. This gets back to what I was talking about earlier. If you've got a convergence of different industries coming together, and I'll take the example of like the concert or the boxing event. This is something that, for example, HBO or Time Warner has offered for years as a pay-per-view product, right? I'm going to stream this live concert event or boxing event, and people pay pay-per-view, and that was subject to a lot of pay TV taxation and communications taxes. At the other end of the spectrum, if I'm Ticketmaster, I'm now dabbling in offering streaming tickets to my events that I'm doing live, and a lot of those events may look exactly the same as the things that HBO and Time Warner and some of those parties were doing years ago in the pay-per-view TV world. It could also be a concert or a sporting event or something along those lines. But Ticketmaster is coming at it from the perspective of, hey, I sell tickets, and that's usually an entertainment, maybe not even subject to sales tax in the most part of the country, and definitely not communications tax. And so you've got this kind of two worlds colliding there, right? And there's other worlds, obviously, right? The conference planners and trade show planners and everything else that that are coming from places that don't necessarily have to deal with these taxes historically, and now they're selling something that functionally looks a lot like this other stuff that people have been paying tax on for years. And so that's going to evolve. Unfortunately, I don't think the tax jurisdictions have necessarily found the sweet spot of where exactly something crosses over from the communications tax world into the non-communications tax world, but that line's going to have to be found.
All right, well, it looks like we are right at time. And Toby, thanks again for putting on this great webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.